Embellishment at this conference has become a flexible term, and I'm going to give it one more distending twist as I deal with print and the digital as forms of presentation of documentary material, letters rather than literary works that in fact I was more used to dealing with as an editor. The project is the Letters of Charles Harper and His Circle, currently in production with Sydney University Press and scheduled for publication in print form next year. The letters in the volume are embellished, we are learning to say, by maps, reproductions of contemporaneous paintings and photographs, extensive explanatory notes, and of course an introduction, note on the texts that sets out the editorial method, and a chronology to keep us honest. Chronologies do that. Until this project, there had been only 36 Harper letters published, scattered through various volumes and never brought together. Through searching in the Harper papers that David Scott Mitchell purchased from the Harper family in 1899, Harper himself, here on screen, born in Windsor in 1813, had died in 1868, and through searching the Henry Kendall and Henry Parkes sets of papers, which are also here at the Mitchell, also the New South Wales State Archives, the State Libraries of Victoria and South Australia, and the Library of Trinity College at the University of Melbourne, we uncovered some 430 letters and biographical documents, mainly from the last 3 decades of Harper's life, from which we, that is my co-editor Chris Venning and I, made a fairly generous selection of 200 items. The letters are not only by Harper, some are by his friends and family, including posthumous letters to do with the editing and publication of a collection of Harper's poetry in 1883. The heavily Bowdlerized texts in which, perpetuated in successive anthologies of Australian poetry, became central to Harper's legacy and shaped his reception in the 20th century. Harper's widow, Mary Harper, who had led the charge towards this publication, carefully saved all the correspondence to do with its production. And so Chris and I faced the familiar problem of over-representation of the less significant. Nevertheless, we made our selection, which was not particularly difficult once we were immersed in the materials. The editing was to be documentary, not critical, as might have been appropriate for literary works. But the subject matter was of inherently literary importance. So it was not hard to rule out many of the official letters in the state archives to do with Harper, usually written in a cringing bureaucratic register concerning Harper's government employment in the post office in the later 1830s in Sydney, in the early 1850s as a teacher, and in the 1860s as a gold commissioner and magistrate on the Araluen diggings just south of Braidwood. And his role later in life on the committee of the local national school at Eurobodalla near Moruya on the New South Wales south coast. The Araluen fields again. And if you could see it a little closer, you would find the actual selection that he made and the house that he built. As we've come to think of the edited selection of letters as a biography in fragments, we could not lightly dismiss such letters. They needed some minimal representation for the light they threw on the social, official, and family man, the Charles Harper who was not only a poet. Embellishment, of course, presupposes something to embellish, a stable object, to polish, enlighten, and inform. So once we had established our canonical selection, the editorial questions of establishing the text of each document in a readable form, and then elucidating its difficulties for the modern reader via explanatory notes, rose into view. At least that would be the trajectory you would expect of such a project, but it is not in fact what we did, because the project, as I'm showing here, had a prehistory. It was originally, the Letters Project was originally an afterthought to this online poetry archive, the Charles Harper Critical Archive, or CHCA as I'll refer to it, whose archival online form we launched in this building in 2018. Some of you, I think, were present for that opening reception for the Sharp conference that year. The CHCA was then officially published in 2019. At first, anyway, the letters were only to be a supplement. So we added images and prepared initial transcriptions of them as we discovered them, always privileging the original manuscript versions for those that other scholars had already published. But as the main project chugged on year by year, the desirability of editing the letters first before the poetry became plainer. To edit literary works in a scholarly way is to know, or try to know, everything you can about those works first. Editing in ignorance of the bibliographical, biographical, and other contexts is always a bad idea. We could get by archivally without this assistance, but not editorially. And we were also realizing that there was lots of evidence about the poem's versional changes in those letters, crucial for the later poetry editing. In short, we needed a factual base to edit from. Et voila, the need for an edition, not just an archive of the letters was born. The actual editing of the poems in all their versions, there's roughly 2,600 versions surviving in relation to 700 poems in the archive, will doubtless further refine the factual base we've established for the printed book. But that will be some years down the track and will most likely be picked up in the archive itself. Anyway, one of the books, the new book of letters, one of its embellishments is an unusual one. And it sort of pains me to have to admit this. It's an appendix listing all the letters not chosen. Yet they are emphatically not rejects. They will have their importance for historians of different stripes and for any future biographer or textual critic of Harper's poems and essays. Work on explanatory notes for the non-selected letters, what we're calling the supplementary letters, is in fact fairly well advanced. They will eventually appear on the Harper website together with images and transcriptions of those supplementary letters. To give the print volume of the favoured 200 a chance to sell, especially to get it into all the libraries, the existing transcriptions of the chosen ones, the selected letters, are going to be taken down. Their images will remain, however, because they're an active part of the editorial underpinning of the book itself. They contain or witness what scholarly editions in print routinely do not report, but instead describe as silent categories, so that the individual examples do not have to be separately reported. They are the aspects of the documents in which very few people are likely to be interested. For instance, the presentation as opposed to the text of the sender, recipient, date of a letter, the position of the addresses on the page, the placement of any postscripts, head notes, or marginal notes in other hands, even the presence of children's scribblings and jottings, which some of the letters actually have. You see, nothing passes beneath the editor's scrutiny, and even these seeming trivia serve as a reminder of what conditioned the survival of these personal, family, and historical documents over the decades. And it reminds us what the letters themselves as documents silently endured. The net result is that fidelity to the letter's textual idiosyncrasies is observed, but not a slavish representation of the layout, which even if we had tried to capture it in print, we would have failed because of the inevitable waywardness of the manuscript hand. We reasoned that the facsimiles in the CHCA provide that physical testimony better than any transcription or textual apparatus could do. In other words, we're letting the online images do the work for those relatively few readers who are interested in such matters. In all of this, we're fully aware that editorially, we are interceding with history on behalf of modern readers. We've anticipated their needs to be, firstly, explanatory notes that make explicit what went without saying for the letter writer and the recipient. Secondly, a fairly regular presentation of the letters that does not distract from or interfere with the reading of the texts themselves. Now, you'd be surprised how many page design issues this raises for scholarly editors who need to balance their dual allegiances to the historical testimony of the documents on the one hand and to readers of them on the other. If there were no digital supplement to the book, we probably would have been more conservative in editorial approach and we would have regularized less than we're going to. Oddly, as things stand, given the existence from next year of both digital archive and printed edition, we felt more justified actually in turning the clock back a bit, deciding against the increasingly close, even extreme fidelity to documentary wrinkles that some recent letters editions of modern writers have adopted. Even so, there is a line to be drawn for an edition that purports to be a scholarly one, and we have drawn it. So we retain Harper's idiosyncratic spellings, many of which are strange, but often historically attested, but we do not preserve the printed letters, compositors' typos. Some of his letters appeared in newspapers. But where there are missing characters or words caused by failures in the carrying surface or by the library's mounting and tight binding of manuscripts in manuscript books, we supply the missing elements in square brackets. We present the letters not as diplomatic transcriptions with their deletions and additions enclosed in, say, in brackets, which would be a truer representation of the manuscript text per se, but rather as edited reading texts in which the various textual difficulties in the original documents and prints have been resolved and the final state of the text preferred. Deleted or superseded wordings and draft forms of those few letters that have survived in both draft and final forms may be inspected in the archive at, the address is charles-harper.org. And occasionally the drafts are the subject of a note in the book. Well, what comes out of this? In our increasingly digital world, you may well ask, why would we bother with a print edition at all? My answer to this is threefold. First, because the act of printing an edition of Harper's letters will likely bring him readers that an online archive would likely not achieve. The well-designed book, even the scholarly one, still has considerable pulling power because it remains a pleasure to read. Reading pleasure shouldn't be underestimated. Second, I don't trust the digital form to have permanent accessibility for reasons I guess that you already know all too well. We can more or less guarantee the transmission of data into the medium and long-term future, but we can't guarantee that of functioning software, markup systems, operating systems, servers, and hardware. In the broader Harper project, we've done the archive, we've done all we can to mitigate this, and indeed the CHCA is based on and designed around a principled critique of XML-TEI, which is the standard form of markup in humanities projects. But still, there can be no guarantees, which is not a good lookout if you're spending some years of your life on a project like this. In this situation, the book form is an immense consolation. And the third reason for the print edition is that print forces you to bring the project up to a uniformly high standard of accuracy for the simple reason that you only get one chance to get it right. Psychologically, this makes sense as an incentive and it lets you get on with your life afterwards. Note that this consideration applies equally to the PDF format. It is the completedness that is the key, the completedness before you walk away. Online projects, in contrast, just seem to hang around, full of high potential, but inherently unfinished until they finally run out of funding or commitment or both. Digital projects are for the very patient and the hopeful. Although, of course, they potentially do many things that books can't and contain an amount of data that your average book publisher would simply blanch at. So, for instance, and committed to the book project as I am, I've not yet finally decided whether to provide the online archive with edited versions of those letters that have not been selected. the supplementary letters. I wince at the objection likely forming in your mind. You'll be saying, is not the same standard necessary for the selected and the supplementary letters despite the shift in medium? Well, actually, I'm not sure it is. Scholars who are used to manuscript work will have little difficulty using the images and the unedited transcriptions, provided we finish the explanatory notes. So at least the non-selected letters will be accessible for research purposes, if not for ordinary reading purposes. I'm pondering this dilemma still, all too aware that every day I spend on what we have deemed to be the less important letters is one more day I can't spend on editing the poems. And they very much need editing, for they have complexities galore. I'd like now to make some remarks about editions and book history and then demonstrate how our edition of the letters exemplifies them. I've argued in the past that scholarly editions perform a cross-section through the print cultural forces of their era, revealing and differentially enlightening them, particularised as they are by the individual literary work. This outcome is arguably better than, and is at least a test of, the book historical generalities to which we've become used and believe to be true. This is why scholarly editions should be treated by book historians as sources of first resort, not secondary ones. So it will be, I predict, with this edition of Colonial Letters. Harper and his circle, for instance, materially benefited from the establishment of regular and relatively fast sailing and then steamship routes from Europe to the Australasian colonies, the parallel development there of coastal shipping services, which was the standard way of getting around before the introduction of railways, and of more reliable postal services. Harper worked for the post office in Sydney for a few years in the later 1830s, but resigned precipitately in 1839. In 1846, he went to live with his brother, Joseph, on the Hunter River. The painting, which is a little less bright in the original, is in the library here. In 1846, he went to this village to live with his brother Joseph on the Hunter River, selling stamps on commission to locals, effectively running a post office on his brother's behalf, for his brother had the contract to sell stamps. There in 1849, he received a large wad of tobacco from a friend whom he had not yet met in person, but who had, in 1843, published a poem praising Harper's poems, leading to their ongoing correspondence that included the exchange of poems. The friend was Henry Parkes. Ever seen Parkes looking like this? That's Henry Parkes as a young man. He was then a small goods trader in Sydney, but destined for greater things. There, because thereafter Harper only lived in Sydney for one 18-month period in 1845 to 46 and would otherwise only be a visitor there, he depended heavily upon the post to maintain contacts with the newspaper editors of Sydney and the wider, if still small, literary world of New South Wales, a colony Harper never left. The principal sets of correspondence are with Parkes, and here Nicol Stenhouse, and especially the younger Henry Kendall. Here he is. You may be familiar with that young Henry Kendall. But it's not the normal one, you see. He said 10 minutes to go. After Harper's death, his widow Mary Harper, in corresponding with Kendall, would discuss the cost and query the safety of dispatching Harper's manuscripts to Henry Martin in Adelaide, who had been chosen to edit the Harper collection called simply Poems, that would appear in 1883. And Harper, in turn, when the volume was in proofs and then calling for second and third proofs, was dependent on the weekly or bi-weekly sailing from Adelaide to Melbourne, where George Robertson was publishing the volume. No postal services and not very much literature. The efficient importation and distribution of books have been well documented by book historians. The mechanics of book production in the colonies, the terms, costs, and the dispiriting unviability of poetry collections achieve a quite precise definition in the letters and notes to our edition. The books by Harper that were never produced, Wild Bee of Australia in 1857, and a posthumous collection in 1871, as well as the one that was published, Poems, in 1883, all depended on the promises of subscribers. That is, if you didn't get enough subscriptions, the publication couldn't go ahead. And the poems in 1883 only appeared finally because some relatives of Mary Harper put up the money and risked their investment, which they largely lost. Earlier in Harper's career, there were those two other books that I mentioned. Here's the scoop, you know, that you get on. You're supposed to get on Insiders on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. I mentioned that Henry Madewell Martin edited poems in 1883, and earlier I said that they were heavily Bowdlerized. Well, who actually did it? His name or his initials are attached to the book, but he does mention in a couple of his letters his mate, who did a lot of the close work, in fact, did the work. We have finally managed to give a probable identification, and his mate is actually his sister, Annie Montgomery Martin. Now, we haven't got a photo of her. I've got to go through these. These are the lovely bits you missed. That's Martin, but we don't. And that's right. And we have this one only of Annie Montgomery Martin. The letters show how the letters that we're publishing show how the poems were selected and editorially burnished or abridged to suit the tastes of the day as Annie understood them, and to Mary Harper's great chagrin and with misleading effects on the texts of those chosen for anthologizing for the next 100 years. So